I'm Tom Morello, and you're listening to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour.
Stand up, you've been sailing way too long.
Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. My name is Steve Scrovan. Both David and Hannah are out this week, so I'm just flying solo. Of course, not completely solo, because I've got the man of the hour, Ralph Nader. Hello, Ralph.
Hi, Steve. This is a good news program.
That's right, Ralph. We've spoken a lot this year about the violence we export overseas. Today, we turn our attention to violence here at home. In this election season, we are hearing a lot about the crime rate, especially in urban areas. This is even though statistics show that the general crime rate has been trending downwards for decades. First up on the program, we welcome Professor Thomas Abt. He is the director of the Center for the Study and Practice of Violence Reduction at the University of Maryland. He is also the author of Bleeding Out, The Devastating Consequences of Urban Violence, and a Bold New Plan for Peace in the Streets. We're going to talk to him about the homicide rates in different cities, particularly why a city like Boston, as of August 1st of this year, has had only 8 deaths, while the similarly populated Washington, D.C. has had 110 murders. What policies and practices are in place to account for that huge discrepancy? Next up will be Mike Jacobson, who led the Center for the Science and the Public Interest and is a well-known nutrition advocate who helped eliminate artificial trans fat food from the food supply, exposed the enormous calorie counts of movie theater popcorn and many restaurant foods, and made nutrition facts mandatory on food packages. His latest project is the National Food Museum, which is what my parents called my bedroom in high school. They were mainly complaining about ants, but this is nothing like that. The mission of the National Food Museum is to promote critical thinking about food's impact on health and the environment, farm animal welfare, social equity, global and domestic hunger, and how the food industry and politics affect America's food system and what we eat. We look forward to speaking with Mr. Jacobson about the museum's progress, their vision for the future, and how you can get involved. As always, somewhere in the middle, we'll check in with our relentless corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber. But first, Washington is losing to Boston in the homicide sweepstakes. Let's see if we can find out why. Thomas Abt is the founding director of the Center for the Study and Practice of Violence Reduction and an associate research professor in the Department of Criminology and Criminal Justice. Abt is the author of Bleeding Out, The Devastating Consequences of Urban Violence, and a Bold New Plan for Peace in the Streets. His work is cited in academic journals and featured in major media outlets, both print and video. His TED Talk on community violence has been viewed more than 200,000 times. Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Professor Thomas Abt.
Great to be with you.
Welcome indeed, Thomas Abt. This is going to be a very interesting comparative program, listeners. It started because I was talking with some reporters who cover street crime in Washington, and I said, do you know about the Boston record and how they're reducing homicides on the streets in Boston? And they didn't even know that. So we're asking you to come on, but I'd like to make a couple prefatory remarks. First of all, this is good news. And as the listeners will see shortly, extraordinarily good news in terms of the reduction of street homicides in Boston. And good news doesn't seem to be news enough for some media outlets. So with that comment, I want to also add that the figures we're citing, listeners, are largely street and domestic homicides. That they don't include what can be called criminal negligence by corporations, like criminal negligence in hospitals, which Johns Hopkins study over 10 years ago estimated 5,000 preventable deaths in hospitals in the United States a week, every week, 5,000, due to what they called, quote, preventable problems. It doesn't also include occupational workplace fatalities or fatalities from toxic exposures, etc. So we're talking about traditional street crime and those that are committed in a domicile area as well. So we're comparing Washington, D.C. has about 689,000 people. Boston has about 675,000 people. As of August 1, there were 110 homicides in Washington, D.C., down from last year, but 110 homicides in Washington, D.C. And in Boston, there have been eight homicides from January to August 1. And This has been a trend in Boston. The city had 70 homicides in 2010, 56 homicides in 2020. Last year, there were 37 homicides for the whole year. And so Boston stands out, and everybody's entitled to ask you, as an expert on the subject, how did this happen? What are the various factors involved here? Who's responsible for the plans? And is it something that can be translated to other cities around the country? So why don't you take it from there, Professor Abt?
Sure. It's a great question. And, I believe the short answer is yes. The lessons we've learned from Boston can be applied in other cities around the country. And that's precisely what my center, the Center for the Study and Practice of Violence Reduction, also known as the VRC for short, was established to do. And we're, in fact, working directly with Boston at this time, but not in D.C. But let's go back to this comparison. It's a really interesting comparison. These two cities, Washington, D.C. and Boston, are about the same size. They have similar socioeconomic characteristics in terms of median household income and poverty rates. And they're also both relatively restricted in terms of their gun laws and regulations. What's the difference and what's going on here? You can't necessarily say with confidence, but I think that it comes down to two basic factors. I think it comes down to teamwork and implementation. And those two are probably a bit wonky for your listeners. So let me explain what I mean here. Violence reduction, I always say, is a team sport. And what I mean by that is that if the individual players on the team can't work well together, the team cannot succeed. So what that means is the cops need to be able to work with the prosecutors, who need to be able to work with the judges, who need to be able to work with the community groups and the service providers and the business groups and the religious leaders and everyone else who has a stake in public safety in a particular jurisdiction. And if those groups can't work well together, it's really challenging to move the needle in terms of violent crime in a particular city. And I think what you see in terms of these two cities is you have one city that has a long history of collaboration and of working quite well together, Boston, and another city that has a pretty uneven, inconsistent record of working well together, and that's DC. Boston, some of your listeners might remember, was home to the Boston Miracle, a series of sort of policies that were put into place in the early 90s that sparked a remarkable reduction in youth homicide during that time period. Public health leaders were involved, African-American clergy leaders were critical, and some scientists and, of course, the police department were also deeply involved. And all of that work combined and that collaborative work drove violence in Boston down significantly. And Boston has been somewhat inconsistent in terms of how well they've kept that collaboration going over the years. But overall, it's a city that's experienced in collaboration and working together. And I think overall, that's a big explanation why both this year and in previous years, Boston has had lower rates of violent crime than many jurisdictions. Now, turn to DC. This type of collaboration that I'm talking about is not easy. You're talking about multiple agencies, governmental groups, non-governmental groups, people with very different political agendas coming to the table with very different perspectives. That's hard in any jurisdiction, but in DC, it's even harder. And the reason for that is structural. DC is this weird hybrid of federal government and local government. And it means that the structures are even harder to get organized and aligned. It's even harder to share information. And it's even easier to let those gaps in communication end up being gaps in collaboration and even sometimes becoming conflicts. And so I think that that's one of the reasons that you're seeing a big difference in terms of performance. Now, homicide is declining in DC after being at very high levels during the pandemic. But it's still much higher than the average city. So that's the first explanation.
Are we talking about over-policing in addition to all these community efforts? Because it's been shown again and again that police patrols do not go into poor, low-income areas as much as they go into wealthy and upper-middle-class areas of cities like Washington, D.C.
I think the first thing is you're referencing a sort of historical trend, which was a very sad phenomenon where, in the 70s and 80s and perhaps before, law enforcement tended to patrol the borders of bad neighborhoods, but not inside those neighborhoods. And in fact, they sort of tried to keep these neighborhoods segregated. And they sort of said, as long as crime happens in these marginalized neighborhoods, we don't really care. We're only going to really respond actively if crime happens in these wealthier neighborhoods. Fortunately, that trend started to reverse in the 90s, where with the sort of the popularization of CompStat, led by the New York Police Department, departments started using data to focus themselves on where the crime was. And so they started mobilizing their resources in the places where crime rates were highest. That was good and bad in some ways. It was good in that you were sending the resources to where they were needed most. But there were concerns about stop and frisk, over policing, mass incarceration. And so the question is can you get the benefit of effective enforcement and other services in a more targeted way so that you can get the benefit without some of the costs? And the very, very encouraging answer is yes, you can. In every jurisdiction all around the country, the vast majority of violence is perpetrated by a surprisingly small number of groups and individuals. A fraction of 1% of a city's population is deeply involved in crime and violence. And you only have to focus on, and when you focus on those individuals, you can get a disproportionate benefit without resorting to massive stops and searches and seizures and arrests and so on and so forth. Similarly, crime is concentrated in these jurisdictions, and jurisdiction after jurisdiction. We have lots of data showing this, not in quote unquote neighborhoods, but in micro locations known as hotspots. And these hotspots disproportionately contribute. For instance, in Boston, about 5% of city blocks in the entire city count for something like 70 to 80% of all shootings. And so the police don't have to be everywhere. They have to be where they matter most. But here's the important thing to remember. It's not just about police, and it can't just be about police. In addition to this principle of focus that I talk about in my book, Bleeding Out, it's also important to have balance. There need to be carrots as well as sticks. Folks need to have something to say yes to, as well as something to say no to. So while you're engaging these high-risk individuals, these people who are most likely to shoot or be shot, you need to back up those warnings of enforcement with offers of supports and services. And that's something that's happening in Boston.
I'm sure some of our listeners want to know about gun safety laws. Do they make a difference? Both Boston and Washington are known to have stronger gun safety laws.
The gun laws is an interesting question. As you and I both noted, both cities have fairly restrictive laws. But Boston is in Massachusetts, which has some of the most restrictive state regulations in the entire country. And Massachusetts as a state has a very low rate of gun violence. And in fact, when you look at correlations between the restrictiveness of state laws and relative gun violence, there's a very strong correlation between those. Generally speaking, the states that do a better job of keeping guns out of the hands of potential criminals, people who are not mentally well, and others who are at risk for doing harm, have lower rates of gun violence. It's not about how many guns there are. It's about the access to guns. And when access to guns is particularly easy, that's when you have higher rates of violence. Now, in DC, they have restrictive gun laws, but they're closer to states that have much more permissive laws, particularly in the South. And no city is an island. And so it's very important for folks to understand that cities can't legislate their way out of these things. They have small jurisdictions and they're porous. People are coming in and out. And so it really matters what's happening in the region and in the state as well.
We're talking with Professor Thomas Abt, University of Maryland, long and varied record of dealing with reduction of violence in cities. What about community policing? Does that play a role? Do you think it could play a role in Boston and Washington, D.C.?
Well, it depends what you mean by community policing, because if you ask people what community policing is, if you ask 100 people, you'll get 100 different answers. And if community policing is just a buzzword, if it just means we have a public relations department that goes into communities and holds occasional meetings, then no, that superficial type of community policing has not been particularly effective. That's what the research shows. But what we have seen is when police partner with communities on specific issues and have a partnership-oriented approach, they're much more effective. And there's much more sort of perceived legitimacy of those efforts. So if it's just a sort of kumbaya, let's play basketball together and do cookouts and that type of thing, no, it's not particularly effective.
What if community policing is defined as living in the community?
There's not a lot of evidence that shows that has a strong relationship where police live relative to crime rates. I'd also just point out that policing is in the midst of a massive recruitment and retention crisis. And so they need all the folks they can get, whether they're inside or outside the jurisdiction.
And what about diffusion to other cities? We've been talking about Boston and Washington. There is a reduction in violent crime around the country. Is the Boston example inviting people from cities like Phoenix and LA and Chicago and Seattle, St. Louis, Cleveland, Louisville, Atlanta, Miami? What's the story there?
Sure. I think there's a lot to learn in Boston. And, Boston is doing a very good job of carrying out the principles that I talked about in my book: focus, balance, fairness. And, we worked directly with Boston starting in April of 2023. And basically what we did is we brought together all of the stakeholders in Boston, led by the mayor with her senior advisor, Isaac Yablo. And we convened folks from law enforcement, folks from the community groups, folks from the advocacy community, and folks from the service providing community. And we said, how can we come together on this very important issue? And how can we make sure we stay engaged with the people and places that matter most? And so working with these stakeholders, the VRC, the organization that I worked with, we were able to come up with a plan. And that plan had three basic prongs. The first is we need to better coordinate our efforts, and we need to have regular meetings among the key players to make sure that we're getting ahead of shootings and preventing retaliatory shootings before they happen. So that meeting, as you mentioned, is now on the books and working quite well. The other thing we said is we're reaching some of the highest risk individuals and offering them services, but we're not reaching enough of them. And so the goal was, let's reach 100% of these high risk individuals, maybe 200 to 300 in the entire city, and make sure we engage them with the offer of high quality supports and services. Boston has been able to do that over the past year and a half or so. And then finally, we need to increase the positive police presence and environmental investments like street lighting and other things that you mentioned in the micro locations, the hotspots where violence was concentrating in Boston. And those efforts are underway as well. And so the vast majority of the credit goes to Mayor Wu and all the people doing the hard work on the ground in Boston.
Let's talk about another factor, the street drug trade. We're not talking about pharmaceutical companies and their drug trade, street drug trade, and the police response time. Can you factor those two in?
Sure. So in the 80s and early 90s, when rates of violence were at their highest in the United States, Violence and drugs were synonymous. There was a tremendous amount of violence in and around the drug trade, particularly crack cocaine, and it drove violence in marginalized communities to extremely high rates. As crime subsided, and basically as the crack epidemic waned, both violence and crime subsided throughout the 90s and 2010s up until basically the pandemic, with a bit of a shock in 2016 after the Ferguson unrest. And what we've seen is there's been a profound disconnect between street violence and the drug trade. We are going through a massive crisis with opioids in this country, and it's causing an enormous amount of deaths. But there's not the violent crime associated with this epidemic that there was with the crack epidemic in the 80s and 90s. It's a very interesting difference. And so while the opioid epidemic is absolutely deadly, we're not seeing sort of gunfights on the streets of our cities in Boston, D.C., or elsewhere between opioid dealers like we did back in the 80s and 90s.
Part of it is that the opiate trade is, quote, legal, promoted by drug companies and intermediaries and pharmacies and too many doctors. So it's above board compared to crack cocaine, for example. What about police response time, Thomas?
Actually, more important to have a proactive presence in and around these hotspots than to have rapid response times. There's a book in criminology called The Tyranny of 911, and it's basically about how police departments are expected to have the absolute fastest response times possible, and that they have to devote a tremendous amount of their resources to that, which leads them to be more reactive than proactive. But it's not clear that having these extremely fast response times leads to less crime in all instances.
Well, before we get to Steve's question, Thomas, tell our listeners how they can get, first, more information about the Boston performance. Second, if they're from cities around the country, how they can connect with people who are trying to do the same thing in their own city that you just alluded to. And give the name of the book that you've written that you'd like them to read.
Sure. My book is called Bleeding Out: The Devastating Consequences of Urban Violence and a Bold New Plan for Peace in the Streets. You can get it anywhere. For more information about what Boston is doing and other cities that are, effectively fighting crime, you can visit our website, vrc.umd.edu. And we've really made a great effort, not just to talk about our own resources, but to create sort of a bibliography of many of the best resources out there in the business. And, in terms of cities that want to replicate the successes of Boston, or in Knoxville where we work, or in St. Louis where we work, we're happy to talk to those cities and to see if they're ready. And you can just reach out to us at the VRC. And if we can't help you directly, we can send you to the people who can. One of the things that we do with every city that we work with, Boston included, is we bring together for a few days local leaders with the sort of best in the business in terms of research and practice in violence reduction. That's, fancy professors from Harvard, but it's also folks who have actually reduced violence on the street, through street outreach, community-based programs, or law enforcement. And we do this intensive practicum where we teach people about the state of the art in violence reduction. And ultimately, there's about 8 to 10 strategies out there that have a really strong track record of success. And no city can effectively implement 8 to 10 things at the same time. And so through our planning process, we say, look, what's the right combination for your particular jurisdiction? What are the 2, 3, 4 strategies at the most that collectively are focused, balanced, and fair that we can help you get started and implement? And we create a plan around those strategies, and then we bring in experts to help them with implementation.
The one thing we really have left out in this discussion is dire poverty, crumbling tenements, ravenous landlords, lack of security for people on a daily basis. How do you figure that aspect?
Well, I think it's a really important question. And what we see is that, of course, poverty, inequality, lack of opportunity, these are all correlated with crime and violence. But when you look at the causal connection, meaning if one of those things changes, does another thing change? It's much murkier. And these issues of poverty and inequality and lack of opportunity are much broader than the issues of violence reduction. I believe that we need to make alleviating poverty a priority in the United States. I believe that we need to reduce income inequality and we need to improve opportunity. But the connection between those things and reductions in crime and violence this year, next year, is pretty attenuated because these are multi-generational struggles. And so what the VRC says is you need to focus on those things, but you also need to focus on the proximate causes of violence, not just the root causes, and that you can have an immediate reduction in violence by focusing on those small numbers of people and places who are disproportionately impacted, disproportionately contributing to gun violence. And so we sort of say, start small, don't start big.
Well, I know some of our listeners are going to object to that. They're going to say it's quite clear everywhere in the country that violent street crime is not as high in middle, upper income, and wealthy neighborhoods in the city. How would you answer that?
Well, I would answer that to say that's true, but what is your answer for the next 3 to 5 years? Are you going to redistribute income from all of those neighborhoods to other neighborhoods? Are you going to, overnight change the quality of public education or increase the number of available jobs? All of those things are extremely important to do. They're things that take generations, and we need to be working on them. But we can do two things at the same time. I would also point out that just look at DC and Boston. These are two wealthy cities with very different pictures in terms of crime. If wealth was just the issue, you wouldn't see so much variation between these two cities. And so what I would say is, of course, these root causes are important, but they're not the only thing that's happening. And these micro strategies are things we need to focus on at the same time as we focus on these macro strategies.
Over to Steve.
Thomas, you talked about offering services to high-risk individuals in these hot spots. Can you get more specific about what some of those services might be and maybe give us an illustrative on-the-ground anecdote?
Sure. So I think one of the most important services that is provided is something called cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT. Now, a lot of your audience might be familiar with CBT. It's used to address addiction. It's used to address anxiety and lots of other things. But studies have shown, a large number of studies have shown that it can also reduce criminal recidivism and violent recidivism among high-risk individuals. And it does that by helping these individuals make better decisions, by helping them address conflicts more thoughtfully, by helping them think and act less impulsively. And it's very practical. It's not Freudian, focused on your sort of youth or things like that. It's very focused on, is your thinking and behavior getting you the outcomes you want? And if not, how can we change those? That type of therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, combined with subsidized employment, combined with other services, can make a big difference. But I want to caution your audience that for these highest risk individuals, these individuals have often been previously exposed to violence. Almost anyone who commits an act of violence was a victim first. And they're often highly traumatized individuals. These individuals need help in changing, and that violence and that trauma that they've experienced has severely impacted their decision making. And so you can't just get someone a job. You can't just help them get their GED. You can't just, work with them on housing. If you're not addressing this untreated trauma and the poor decision making that comes out of that, then ultimately they can't make use of better jobs, better education, better housing. And so it's very important to, in addition to providing supports, to do this type of CBT or cognitive behavioral therapy.
Can I ask a follow-up here? I mean, what happens? There's a bunch of social workers descend on a neighborhood and say, hey, come to a meeting. How does this work on a practical basis?
In a practical way, a city does a problem analysis, and that problem analysis, they review all of the homicide incidents from the past 3 to 5 years, the non-fatal shooting incidents from the past 3 to 5 years. And they do an analysis and they create a profile of the types of people who are involved in this violence. And they're typically people who are trending a little bit older. The average age is often, 25 to 27, not younger as many people think. They're often deeply involved in the criminal justice system with many arrests and previous convictions. And so what you're realizing is that violence is being driven by some of the most disconnected people in your city. And so how do you engage them? Well, you often need to engage them because they don't trust authority. You need to engage them with people they know and trust. And so you need to use street outreach workers, folks from their neighborhood who they trust, to help engage them and bring them into services, because they won't come to services through sort of normal means. Once you've brought them in and established that relationship, then the treatment, then the work can begin. But it's not just, open your doors and people will walk in. There has to be relentless outreach, relentless engagement. And some folks will still, not want to take those services. And no one's suggesting that these services work all the time. But what we believe is when we use targeted enforcement, we want to be able to say that we did everything we could before that happens to give people an opportunity to make a better choice. If ultimately they don't make a better choice, then it's time to hold them accountable. But we prefer to say we did everything we could first before that became necessary.
Professor Abt, we're hearing a lot about soaring crime rates from the Donald Trump campaign, and all statistics say that this is trending down. Crime rates. What do you have to say to that?
If you look at what's happening across the country, as of July, according to data from a sample of 29 cities assembled by the Council on Criminal Justice, where I happen to be a senior fellow, the homicide rate during the first half of this year is actually 13% lower than during the same period last year. And that's 319 fewer homicides across these 29 cities. And that's some very good news. And it's building on good news from the year before and the year before that. So just so folks know sort of where we are in terms of violent crime in the United States, we had this massive increase, almost 30% increase in murders between 2019 and 2020, the first year of the pandemic. It's a historic increase. We had never seen anything like it. Then there was that upward trend continued into the next year, and there was a 7% increase in murders across the country in 2021. But then the tide started to turn. Homicide dropped from 2021 to 2022, and then last year it fell 13% from 2022 to 2023. So the good news is that we have actually now gotten ourselves to nationally where we are just under the homicide rate that we were at before the pandemic began. And so while you're hearing a lot of fear mongering out there about violent crime, the truth is that we have erased that massive surge that happened during the pandemic. And that's very good news.
And to what do you attribute this trend downward across the country?
I think there's a number of causes. I think most experts agree that crime rates surged during the pandemic because of the pandemic itself, because of the social unrest in the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis, and all of the discontent after that had a big impact. And also there was a massive surge in legal purchases of guns during the pandemic. People were anxious and afraid. They bought a lot of guns, and a lot of first-time gun owners bought guns at that time. And unfortunately, a lot of those guns were lost or stolen and went into the wrong hands very quickly. So those are the three major factors that drove the increase in the beginning. The further we get away from those efforts have subsided. So legal gun purchases have subsided. We're further away from the aftermath of Minneapolis. And of course, we've recovered from the pandemic. The other thing I would say is that there was a massive investment by the Biden administration in both policing and in community-based programs. Remember that balance that I was talking about? They used a balanced approach. And I believe that had an effect as well. And it makes the strategies that I'm talking about at the local level easier to do because there's federal support for them. So those are the 4 factors I would say.
By the way, do these homicide figures include police shootings?
They don't. That's not the way the FBI characterizes them. There's about 19,000 homicides a year, according to the FBI. And then there's about 1,000 police-involved killings every year on top of that.
That's an important thing to consider. Oh, we're out of time, unfortunately. We've been speaking with Thomas Abt, the founding director of the Center for Study and Practice of Violence Reduction, and an associate research professor in the Department of Criminology and Criminal Justice at the University of Maryland. Once more, the website, and I want you to know that I've spoken to one of the editors of the Metropolitan page of the Washington Post, who was not familiar with the Boston situation and is interested in calling you to get information and possibly an interview.
Well, always happy to chat. And the VRC is located at the website vrc.umd.edu.
Thank you very much, Thomas.
Thank you.
We've been speaking with Professor Thomas Abt. We will link to his work at ralphnaderradiohour.com. Up next, we speak to food nutrition expert Michael Jacobson about his pet project, a National Food Museum. But first, let's check in with our corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber.
From the National Press Building in Washington, D.C., this is your Corporate Crime Reporter Morning Minute for Friday, August 9, 2024. I'm Russell Mokhiber. The owners of a California funeral home have been ordered to pay $950 million to the families of 190 victims whose bodies were found decaying inside the funeral home. That's according to a report from Time magazine. The judge in a civil case ruled that Return to Nature Funeral Home in Penrose, Colorado, should pay grieving families who paid for cremation services and were given fake ashes while their bodies decomposed in a maggot-infested building. The couple allegedly took $130,000 from families for cremation and burial services that were never carried out. But the legal victory is largely a symbolic one, as families may never see a payout. For the Corporate Crime Reporter, I'm Russell Mokhiber.
Thank you, Russell. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. I'm Steve Scrovan, along with Ralph. Our next guest is on a mission to promote health through nutrition. Let's find out about his latest project to do this. Michael Jacobson holds a PhD in microbiology from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and he co-founded and then led the Center for Science in the Public Interest for 4 decades. Dr. Jacobson is the author of Salt Wars, the battle over the biggest killer in the American diet, and he's the founder of the National Food Museum. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Mike Jacobson.
Thank you very much. Glad to be back.
Yeah, welcome back, Mike. You know, I remember interviewing you in 1969 at MIT in Cambridge, Mass. And I asked you, are you in this for the long haul? And you said yes. And what? That was an understatement.
Little did I know what I was getting into, Ralph. And you lured me to Washington with a big, fat, zero salary.
Well, you built up a powerful organization, Center for Science in the Public Interest, and I think more than any other group, because you were a master at mass media. You were on the national TV shows like the Phil Donahue Show and the Mike Douglas Show, and you were really a great media messenger. Probably changed more diets for the good than any other institution. You might have changed the diet of 40 million people. And now that you have left the Center for Science and Public Interest, your new great project is to start a National Food Museum. There are little food museums here and there on specialized topics. The Smithsonian had an exhibit, but unlike timber and lumber museums, there's 32 of those in the country, sponsored heavily by the industry. There are numerous medical museums. There's even one tort museum, as our listeners know, in Connecticut. But there is no National Food Museum with the range and depth that your proposal encloses. And you're in a process of getting this underway, which we're going to talk about. And the vision for it in your proposal is, quote, a world where food and how it's grown contribute to healthy people, a sustainable planet, and a more vibrant culture. And your mission is to celebrate and explore the transformative power of food to nourish people and our planet. And in addition to all the wonderful improvements that you're going to exhibit and inform people about once this museum gets underway, you want people to enjoy it and have fun. That's what you've always been about, Mike. You have a deep sense of consumer psychology here. The museum, listeners, is envisioned to be 25,000 square feet of exhibits with an annual budget between 5 and 6 million, just to give you an idea of its scale. So let's get underway. When did you think this up? And tell us about how you're trying to get it done.
Thank you very much, Ralph, for having me on your radio show. A wonderful, unique show that promotes activism on such a wide range of issues. The idea, a food museum, came to me in COVID when I was, it was a great time to go to museums, any that were open, because almost nobody was there. And I wandered around different museums in Washington, and at some point had the realization that food is so important in everybody's life. 3 meals, 5 meals for some people a day, just the enjoyment of eating, the sociability with friends and family, and the health impact that what we eat is contributing to about 500,000 deaths per year from heart disease, stroke, cancers, various other health problems. And the impact of what we eat and how it's grown on the environment is enormous, starting with climate change, where something like 25% of greenhouse gases are related to our food system. So that was wandering around the museums is when I had the idea for a National Food Museum. But you alluded to my lurid past of going on the Donahue show and Mike Douglas with tubes of fat showing how fatty different fast food meals are. I always liked to translate the science or the substance of the issues that I worked on at Center for Science in the Public Interest, translate them into something people would understand. Hence, I would never talk about grams of fat. I would talk about teaspoons of fat. How many teaspoons of fat are in the Big Mac and large order of fries? And then I would show that graduated cylinder filled with 10 or 20 teaspoons of fat. People can relate to that. So I love doing that sort of thing.
I remember when you were on the Donahue show and you lifted up this vial of exact amount of fat in a double cheeseburger, according to the company's own recipe. Like 10 million people must have gasped all over the country. This is going down my gullet?
Yeah.
I better rethink this.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm sure we changed a lot of people's minds. But also at Center for Science, we realized that it's not just education, it's also getting policy changes. And I think some of our big successes were getting nutrition labels on food packages and banning trans fat. We led the efforts on both of those. And the ban on trans fat is a huge bit of progress. Foods are healthier because they don't have artificial trans fat. So that's when I was at CSPI. And now the museum is going to do mostly education, some advocacy. And as you mentioned in the introduction, some of the exhibits will focus on how healthier diets could improve our health, how better farming techniques could improve the climate. And then there's that intersection between climate and health. And I've thought of making a cow a symbol of the museum, or maybe an anti-symbol, because meat eating is a major contributor to disease, and it's a major contributor to climate change and other environmental issues and animal welfare issues, of course. So the museum will get into those. Those are probably the more controversial issues. But there's so many fascinating issues related to food. I think about the history of the human diet, going back to the Stone Age, say 10 or 12,000 years ago, and the future of the human diet. It'd be wonderful to have an exhibit showing how our diet has changed and may well change in the next 75 years, when many kids just growing up will still be alive. And I think the most popular exhibit at the Smithsonian is the First Lady's gowns. And I can see an exhibit, What the Presidents Ate, with Trump's cheeseburgers, Reagan's jelly beans, Clinton transitioning from his junk food diet into a vegan diet, and going back to George Washington, because there's good information about what all these presidents ate. So that's it. I think we can have fun exhibits and important exhibits.
Well, Mike, one of your three themes in your advocacy over the decades is to try to reduce the amount of fat, salt, and sugar in corporate design diets targeted at youngsters. I mean, these big food companies, which you have challenged again and again, have produced the obesity situation, which has skyrocketed since 1980. And it's well known how they changed the diet of youngsters on TV, seducing them with tastes good, melts in your mouth, bypassing family and parental discipline. Go through quickly, before we get into the audiences and programs that you envision for the National Food Museum and how people can get more information. Go through the fat, salt, and sugar.
You put your finger on several of the most important contributors to poor health. Fat, it's not any kind of fat, it's saturated fat. Kind of fat that's in meat, cheese, other dairy products, whole milk, ice cream, and so on, contributes to heart disease and stroke in a big way. And salt is something that people don't talk about enough. I wrote a whole book on it, but it's something that's easy to forget about. It doesn't take up any volume in our food, but salt is a major cause of high blood pressure. And the Centers for Disease Control has estimated that the current American diet, high in sodium, from mostly sodium chloride, salt, is causing as many as 100,000 premature deaths a year in the U.S. Just from that one element. And the biggest source of salt is not the salt shaker on our tables. The biggest source of salt is the salt that corporate chefs add to their foods at table service restaurants, fast food restaurants, and packaged foods. That's where we get 75% of our sodium. And that amount could easily be reduced. It could be cut in half if companies really made an effort. It'd be pretty easy to do. So anyhow, salt is in that triumvirate of dietary killers. It's very important. And then sugar or sugary foods, particularly soft drinks, Coca-Cola in the lead, contributing to obesity, diabetes, and that's just such a scourge in the American diet. And all of that is post-World War II. And once television came in the 50s and 60s, companies had kids glued to their seats, watching all the kiddie shows with the advertising promoting these junk foods. Sugary breakfast cereals, of course, is a classic, but fast food advertising, and now TV isn't as important as it used to be. Now, a lot of the advertising has moved to the internet.
Just to give people a graphic, let me ask you this question, Mike. A classic can of Coca-Cola, not Diet Coke, just a regular Coca-Cola that has sold billions of these cans. How much sugar does it have in it in terms of teaspoons?
10 teaspoons of sugar in a 12-ounce can. So
how many?
Just pick 10.
10 teaspoons of sugar. Well, listeners, if you were creating your own Coca-Cola, you had the formula that's in some vault in Atlanta where Coca-Cola is. You put water in, and you want a little sweet. Would you put 10 teaspoons of sugar? I mean, you might put 1, 2, 3, but 10? See how they addict people?
Yeah, absolutely. It's, but they do taste tests. They figure out what people like the most and then market the hell out of it, regardless of the health consequences for the public and the economic consequences for the nation. The diet-related diseases cost hundreds of billions of dollars, and it's hard to fight that. These foods taste good and they're convenient.
Museums are the great educational institutions of our generation. I mean, more people go to museums than attend professional sports around the country. And so you have in your proposal here which is on your website. Give your website, by the way, and we'll repeat it again.
www.food.museum. That's it.
That's easy.
Food.museum.
Food.museum. Okay, let's start with the audiences. Who are your audiences?
Well, in a way, it's everybody, but the prime audience is families with kids who are maybe 8, 9, 10 years old and up. The exhibits are not going to be aimed at 3-year-olds. I think they're going to be more sophisticated than that. So it's families, and you haven't mentioned where the museum is located because we don't have a location yet. And that's a key thing. In a big city with lots of tourists, Washington, D.C. would be my ideal location, partly because it's a big city with a lot of tourists, and uniquely, it has policymakers, it has people who work on Capitol Hill in the administration, advocacy organizations, and many of them have kids. So that's my ideal location. But DC is a very expensive place to create a museum because of competition from the free Smithsonian. So maybe it'll be in Chicago, Boston, Philadelphia. Who knows? That'll be a big choice.
Well, listeners, Mike is looking for some big benefactors. I know that from experience, Mike, our audience is not going to be funding this museum. They may be subscribing to the 6 times a year Nutrition Action newsletter by the Center for Science Public Interest, and they can make small contributions to food.com. They're all deductible because this is a nonprofit 501c3 institution. But if you in the audience know some rich people who are enlightened, worried about posterity, their own children and grandchildren, and where the world is going, and want a great outlet for their charitable contributions of a significant size, tell them about the National Food Museum proposal. But you have other audiences. Why don't you go through those briefly?
Well, one audience is local kids. We want to go out to schools with exhibits, talks, movies, perhaps, and reach kids at their schools, and also, of course, reach kids in the museum itself with exhibits and also programs. I hope we'll have cooking classes for both kids and adults. We will have information on our website for kids and adults. We want to reach senior citizens and hopefully get them involved, both seeing the exhibits, also acting as docents once we open up a facility. And then people of color, I think we can reach, especially with exhibits and programs pertaining to what people in the local community are consuming. So every big city, Houston, Chicago, New York, Los Angeles, have practically every ethnic group, every nationality under the sun. And a part of the museum will reflect that. And also, I see it as kind of a flagship for food activists around the country, a place for them that would publicize activities, and a place that, kind of the mother church of food activism that I think will be a fun service to perform. So the museum will be wide-ranging in terms of audiences, exhibits, and I should mention as you mentioned, I went to MIT. I'm a scientist, and the exhibits are going to be science-based. They're not going to be, just kind of off the top of my head or kind of what concerns are popular, even if they're unfounded. And we'll blow the whistle on some phoniness, like with dietary supplements, where there's so much dishonesty in that segment of the world, the food world, and deceptive advertising aimed at kids or aimed at adults. And some of that we'll try to turn into games, because the museum has to be fun. And you mentioned some of the fun stuff we did. And you may remember the Junk Food Hall of Shame that we built and installed at the Ralph Nader Visitor Center. When was that, 1980 or so?
Yeah, I remember that. We'll call it a thinking tourist tour of Washington.
That's right. So the Junk Food Hall of Shame dissected different foods and explained what they're really made of, what the health consequences of eating them are, We had a golden arch at the top with Ronald McDonald hanging by the neck from it. It was quite a spirited exhibit. You and I held a press conference that had global publicity, and the number of visitors at the visitor center skyrocketed because people loved it. So we're going to make it fun.
There are plenty of billionaires around and multimillionaires wondering what to do with their dead money invested in the stock market and make it come alive and reach millions of people. It'd be a great legacy for major donors to the National Food Museum.
We're also looking for a city that would contribute a building. And I think the museum would be a jewel in any city's civic landscape, adding to the other museums and other attractions they have. So a city could be a tremendous help.
Well, unfortunately, we're out of time, Mike. We've been talking with Dr. Michael Jacobson, co-founder and larger of the Center for Science and Public Interest for over 50 years. And the contact numbers, listeners, are food.museum and info@food.museum. Thank you very much, Mike.
Thanks so much, Ralph. Take care.
I want to thank our guests again, Thomas Abt and Mike Jacobson. For those of you listening on the radio, that's our show. For you podcast listeners, stay tuned for some bonus material we call the Wrap-Up, featuring the incomparable Francesco DeSantis with, in case you haven't heard, a transcript of this program will appear on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour Substack site soon after the episode is posted. Subscribe to us on our Ralph Nader Radio Hour YouTube channel, and for Ralph's weekly column, it's free. Go to nader.org. For more from Russell Mokhiber, go to corporatecrimereporter.com. The producers of the Ralph Nader Radio Hour are Jimmy Lee Wirt, Hannah Feldman, and Matthew Marin. Our executive producer is Alan Minsky. Our theme music, Stand Up, Rise Up, was written and performed by Kemp Harris. Our proofreader is Elizabeth Solomon. Our social media manager is Stephen Wendt. Join us next week on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. Thank you, Ralph.
Thank you, everybody. And I've got to say, I'm out with a new book, Let's Start the Revolution. It's very relevant to the politics of 2024 and very readable, suitable for a gift to your local libraries or to a friend, relative, neighbor, or even better, to your circle of activists.
Stand up, step up, step up. You ought to step up. Rise up, rise up. I know you ought to rise up and stand up, stand up. You've been saying way around. I think you should step up. I think that you should step up. Rise up, down.